Hey there, my name's Samanvita,
My name is Evelyn.
and you're listening to HCI Ideas. HCI Ideas is a podcast where we discuss research, receive advice, and learn about the cool things taking place at the Human Computer Interaction Institute of Carnegie Mellon University. Today, we'll be speaking with Professor Laura Vinchesi about the importance of design and UX to the field of HCI, as well as her own journey through both industry and academia. Thanks for tuning in, and enjoy. Laura, do you think you could introduce yourself and your role at the Institute?
Sure. I'm Laura Vinchesi. I'm an assistant teaching professor in the HCII, teaching from within the Masters of Human Computer Interaction program, where I've completed 3 semesters. I'm a relative newcomer, so coming up on not quite 2 years.
Cool. And I see you've had extensive industry experience before becoming a teaching faculty. So do you think you could give us a rundown?
Sure. Maybe I'll start with the most recent and sort of move backwards. And a general comment that I'll make is that I've actually always had a toe in academia as an adjunct here and there over the course of most of my career because I've really enjoyed it. I really like teaching and learning from students, and the whole sort of academic environment for me has always felt like a nice counterbalance to my professional industry career. So, before joining the HCII, I worked as lead visual and information designer at Seagrid, which is a autonomous mobile robots for material flow company. They make robots that are used in warehouse environments for all kinds of logistical applications, manufacturing, and so on. And I joined a new UX team where the charge was to develop a software system that would enable users of those robots to better, more efficiently, and more easily manage fleets of robots. And so that was super interesting work. And primarily what I did there was establish UX design team infrastructure, including things like design system, design principles, a design playbook, which consists of a variety of sets of design activities that are repeatable for use in different contexts to achieve design goals, right? So, sort of setting design strategy for the team to use repeatably. And then I also helped define product strategy as well as product vision. What might it look like in 6 to 8 years for users of these autonomous mobile robots to be working in multimodal capacities, using virtual reality, using augmented reality to more efficiently manage robot fleets. So defining that vision, making a vision video, writing scripts, doing storyboards, interviewing key stakeholders, even, working with an animator, a video animator to kind of depict characters that matched our personas. That was all really interesting work.
Sure, yeah, I did have a question about that one actually. You mentioned that you helped develop sort of what this would look like in the future, but do you think you could tell us what that vision was?
Yeah, so the vision was I will briefly describe the present to help you appreciate why we needed to depict a future vision. In the present, the engineers who design the robotic applications and then set them up within warehouse environments use surprisingly rudimentary tools to do that, right? Like things like tape measures, pencils, paper, taking photos with their phones. It's surprisingly basic, right? And even in the last year and a half, augmented reality tech that is available even on like personal devices, personal mobile devices, would enable a much more efficient way or ways of doing that, using different types of measurement, different types of visualization of routes for a robot through a complex environment. And that's just for some of the engineering personas. But we also focused on the chief supply chain officer as a persona. And her needs had to do a lot more with being able to look at data visualizations from across her many facilities, right? Which facilities are performing well, which ones are having challenges in terms of how the like throughput measurements and things like that. She also needs to be able to predict productivity surges in the warehouses and be able to engage, say, robot rental for like a holiday season, right? Like, let's say it's an e-commerce site, or let's say it's some other kind of manufacturing that has seasonal surges. What kind of information does she need to see, and on what modes, in order to have much more command over the business? So, out of like a suite of 5 personas, those are two. And it was generally that kind of envisioning using advanced technology to better achieve business goals.
Going back to the rundown, do you think you could tell us about your experience at Luma?
Yeah. So before Secret, I was at Luma Institute for about 11 years. And I started there as employee number one post spin out. So Luma Institute was a startup that spun out of a design consultancy here in Pittsburgh called Maya Design. And Luma's mission is to enable individuals and teams and organizations to work more innovatively and to work better through the application of human centered design. So we designed learning programs, whether certifications or online courses or even self driven learning modules on a digital platform, as well as tools to help people in any kind of organization or industry learn how to use human centered design or design thinking in their own work, right? Even if you're not a designer, how can you take advantage of the techniques of basically product development and human centered design of products and services in whatever your work is, whether it's policy or designing procedures. So, over the course of that 11 years, I started out doing communication design work, got more into learning experience design work, facilitation, becoming like a lead facilitator, a lead instructor, and then even designing some of the tools on the digital platform, recording lots of videos for how to think about using design methods in different contexts. So it really ran the gamut, as is often the case in a startup. You're wearing many hats, doing all kinds of things. It was awesome. I traveled a lot. So yeah, that was wide and pretty varied.
Could you speak more to the work culture as being part of the company for so long and seeing it grow from just a seed to an established company? How did your role shift and how did the company culture shift?
In terms of how my role shifted, I would say my role expanded in both breadth and depth. So I started out basically in a support position. And as my skills and experience deepened over time, I was able to take on management roles and have more influence on strategy and outcomes. So, and that's not uncommon when you start in a startup. It's a windy road, but if you're there for a long time, it's not uncommon to acquire a sphere of influence. And as the company got bigger, culture is a really big topic. And with any organization, I think the seeds of culture really come from leadership. And so I think we had, on the whole, a very energetic, fairly loose, friendly culture, meaning there wasn't a lot of hierarchy. And that has pluses and negatives because everybody's kind of moving fast and wearing a lot of hats and really working highly cross-functionally in pursuit of getting things done and getting things shipped and built and delivered. It was a lot of fun. And you'd travel to Asia or Europe with your coworkers and work really hard, have some really interesting experiences in your travels, and that's really a galvanizing thing. And then, as the company gets bigger, you start to feel some of the pressure of needing more structure and needing perhaps sometimes more hierarchy. And there's always trade-offs with building more structure and what you have to give up when you do that, balanced against what you're gaining. And so there's always a tension around trying to strike that balance.
Given your experience in the various stages of a company, really, was it more difficult, in your opinion, to establish, kind of getting started, a cohesive design system, or was it actually harder to maintain and improve on existing systems?
Well, in both of the experiences that we've talked about, at Luma, we were just starting to establish a design system when I left. And having been there for so long and worked on so many aspects of what the visual brand looked like and felt like and how we talked about it, that felt like a natural compilation and sifting and distillation effort that made a lot of sense, and it just seemed to kind of flow. In my other experience, their design system was they had started to build a bespoke design system internally when their engineers had additional capacity, which was infrequent. So the challenges there really had to do with getting the design system prioritized as like front burner work, and also to be able to justify why it should be a bespoke design system for such a small team, as opposed to leveraging something like Google Material, right? And branding an existing system that had everything already built out. That is a tension for smaller teams or teams where there's limited capacity, whether it's development capacity or leadership capacity, whatever it is, to sort of figure out which of those things makes the most sense.
Were there any specific projects you worked on while you were there that you think were particularly exciting or maybe went somewhere you didn't expect?
Are you talking about Luma?
Luma or your general experience?
Okay. Well, the first one that jumps to mind is a facilitated event at the White House, at the Obama White House. Our company was only 6 people at that time. It was early on at Luma in the early days. And the White House had initiated an innovation lab. And so one of the first things that group wanted to do was solicit input from basically design leaders in, how might we establish a robust innovation lab that uses frameworks that allow for easy application, right, into government challenges. And so Luma was one of the firms competing for that position. And all 3 firms met on the same day, and we all participated in a session that Luma actually designed. We designed the session where a variety of cross-sectoral leaders came to talk about how to design cross-sector programming. That was an amazing experience. It was like high pressure. We all bought suits, put our hearts and souls into it, and it went really well. And we won the job of building out the curriculum for the Innovation Lab. So that was great. That was a highlight. Another highlight was traveling to Singapore to work with the Singapore Design Council to run a whole program that span, I think it was like 3 or 4 weeks, to help Singaporean businesses learn this system for human-centered design application and apply it to their business challenges. So we got to work with all these different organizations that had been chosen by their design council on their challenges after running really big workshops. And one interesting tidbit about that is the Luma workshops were highly dialogue driven rather than just like sage on a stage, we used to call it. So we would often be asking questions of the audience, right? That's just how we ran those experiences. But in Singapore, it's considered somewhat rude to interrupt or speak when the teachers, right, are doing their thing, right? So we kept inviting input from the group and nobody would raise their hand. And we were so confused, like, why is this happening? And finally someone explained to us that, there was like a cultural difference there that we were not aware of. And so once we figured that out, we kind of reconfigured. But that was a great moment of appreciating just the balance you have to strike in a different culture with how you're asking questions, how you're delivering information, how you're teaching.
That's very interesting. And sort of building on this, your own work revolved around teaching other people the best principles of design to use for their own purposes. Do you think that cultural gap is something that you had to address or something that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, sure. I would say 100%. Any kind of teaching, it is important to try to understand cultural variables. And that is not limited to East, West, or country to country, right? That is even within a company, like within an organization, you might have one business unit that has its culture or its subculture, and another business unit that has its subculture. This is just humans, right? There's cultural conflict where there are these kind of natural clashes, even from team to team to team. So, yes, I would say that in teaching and leadership in general, one needs to have a fairly high cultural sensitivity, or at least awareness that culture is a major factor in knowledge transfer and that there are so many translation filters in play. So, the Singapore example, there's a great terminology that was used to explain it to us, where what they said was, we know that in the West, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and that is a common perception in education, right? Like, but in the East, and I'm using very, very general terms like West and East, but the way it was described to us then was it's really more the raised nail gets the hammer. That was an incredibly vivid analogy or way of articulating the fairly complex perception of cultural factors, right? So we were like, oh, okay, we get it. And how do we now adapt, right, in order to enable optimum learning? So that's certainly true in teaching at CMU too, I find, right? Like there are many subcultures within however we think of the culture at Carnegie Mellon. There are cultures represented, by nationality, by gender, by undergrad, grad, PhD. There are cultures represented in different schools and then in different departments within different schools. And so it would be really interesting. You're giving me a really interesting idea about defining like a set of almost heuristics or things to be aware of, careful of, thinking of from the culture standpoint when you are interacting with students. Something to do, there's language. What kind of language do you use? What kind of body language do you use? How to manage groups of when you know that there are people from a culture where women in positions of leadership are viewed differently than they're viewed here, for example. So many things, right? So yeah, I would say that's an important part of learning to be a sensitive instructor.
When you were talking about how you worked with the White House and other governments as well, is there a gap ever between work that's done in industry or academia and having it be adapted into policy? Because I feel it's the work of industry professionals and people in academia to define these like frameworks that you're talking about and sort of best practices, but do you find that that gets translated over to where it needs to be implemented, like in government policies?
Sometimes. Well, I mean, I think a really interesting very recent example is that we had Jody Forlizzi from the HCII speak to Congress in the defining of the Biden artificial intelligence government position, right? And so the HCII fed directly into the development of policy in that case. And that's a complex question. You're making me think. The interplay back and forth between academia and industry, especially in tech, but probably in general, I'm not sure that it's the case that one typically leads and the other follows. I think that there's like a healthy symbiosis, let's say, where research coming out of universities like Carnegie Mellon informs the development of tools and practices and approaches that are adopted in industry. But at the same time, in industry, the application of those things yields new ways of thinking about how to frame certain problems and like commercialization of tools leads to like all kinds of new opportunities, right? And then that kind of feeds back in. So
I guess just as a person on the internet, I often see that people express the opinion that policymakers need to kind of consist more of people with a technical background, especially in terms of things like AI or just other big tech that affects everybody. So, from someone on the inside, how much of that is rooted in reality? Like, do you feel that policymakers need to get more experts in the fields in positions of power? Or is the current interplay, whatever exists, do you think that's sufficient?
well, we're really seeing this play out in the generative AI domain right now, where you have private companies releasing super powerful tools, right? And then you have industry trying to figure those out, maximize, take advantage. Like the internet's a good example. In the 80s and 90s, it seems to take a while for people to understand things in enough depth to realize where there needs to be legislation, right? Or policy. And I think we're in that moment right now, right? Where we're trying to get our arms around like what even is the extent of the capacity or the capability here, and where does it need to be regulated? Where does there need to be policy? Another example just popped into my head. You know how in Europe there's been policy and legislation developed related to all these accords to eliminate massive amounts of waste, right? And of course, for the organizations making those scores, it's a revenue generator, right? But in some places, leaders identify the need for policies that protect the collective.
Just in the interest of time, we're going to pivot to your work at CMU and as adjunct faculty. I just want to ask, how does your experiences with teaching at CMU for a little while at a time, how does that impact your work in industry or like vice versa?
Yeah. So I've done a lot of adjuncting kind of here and there over the years. And I would say that the effect it has on my professional work is that it allows me much easier access to, let's say, language of critique. The person who can articulate the concepts readily and more easily is the person who can really speed up a team's efficacy, right? Like you need someone to be able to articulately talk through what process, why, when, how, right? And so to a great extent, that's kind of what is explicit in teaching. So being able to leverage that in a professional work environment is super useful. Not that I'm teaching in those moments, but being able to articulate conceptual underpinnings for things is very useful for professional teams. And then, of course, going the other way, bringing lots and lots of real world case studies and examples of application, successes, failures into the classroom is like students really want that. They really want to say, can you give me an example? Right. And then the more professional experience you have, because that's where they're headed, you can really put your finger on lots of personal examples and adjacent sort of experiences you've seen play out as great illustrations of the conceptual stuff that you're teaching and the academic stuff that you're teaching.
So, sort of building on that, how would you say CMU as a college or the classes, how would you say it fares in terms of preparing its students for a career in design or HCI? Are there any best practices for that transition between learning at college and a job?
That's a good question for me because I'm also an undergraduate alumna of the design school. Way back then, when I graduated as an undergrad in communication design, graphic design, in my early jobs, my employers were saying things like, yeah, the CMU grads, they really know how to think, right? They really know how to think and communicate through a problem. In the graduate program, in terms of best practices, yeah, I guess one piece of advice I might give is, and this is much easier said than done, people get really stressed out about getting a job, which I would be too. And there's a certain period, like towards the end of graduate program, for example, there's an enormous amount of like anxiety and pressure building up around getting a job. And so like some portion of the end of the program is consumed by that. And I completely appreciate the challenges there, but it's a kind of a one-time experience in your life. And so I guess I would say to the extent that it's possible, really try to like wring out as much learning while you're in school as you can. There's so much there to take advantage of. And, your work life is coming and you're going to be in it for a long time. And so like really try to maximize your time in school. I guess another best practice would be I talk with a lot of students about their portfolios and resumes, and think about who you are as a person and what is unique and different about what you are bringing to a role at a company that nobody else can bring, because it's you versus someone else. Generally, people have a lot of overlapping skills. They might have some overlapping background experience, but really, like, who are you and what uniqueness do you bring, either in your personality or your approach to problems or your points of view in the world, right? What are you bringing to an organization that only you can bring? And how can you really emphasize and celebrate that in your presentation of yourself, right? Whether it's your resume, your portfolio, or your interviewing. I see a lot of students tending to conform to like storytelling devices that are represented in portfolio templates and things like that. That's okay. But really also make sure do some thinking about like who you are and what's unique about you.
All right, I will keep that in mind personally. So, one last question before we wrap up. So, we've had 30 years of the HCII so far, and we've accomplished many things. But what do you hope that the next 30 years of HCI as a field, or CMU's institute specifically, might hold?
We're at a point now in the culture where for most people, human computer action is a daily given. It's how we live. And in that world, what does that mean for how we design experiences? I think the human-centered piece that needs to remain a constant and an increased focus, if anything. We're talking about artificial intelligence. It's kind of all the time, everywhere all the time. What does that really mean for human experience? Bringing up Jody for Lizzie again, who in one of her talks, this is one of my favorite ways to think about the AI moment. There's this phrase, human in the loop. And I think in one of her lectures, she inverts that paradigm to say, it's not human in the loop. That implies that the AI is in control, right? It's AI in the loop. Humans are in control, right? Like, let's not lose sight of the emphasis. It seems simple, but it's actually a really important difference. Hopefully that will guide coming decades. How do we use technology to provide more meaningful, valuable work to more people who are displaced by automation? Right? That's going to be a pretty big challenge. How do we use technology to alleviate cultural chasms, political divides, terrible schisms that are seemingly only increasing, right? How do we use technology to unify rather than divide? That's a critical need now and in the future. So those are a couple of good ones that come to mind. I will say, as a mother of a teenage daughter, I can't say that the mobile devices and the internet has had a net positive. Obviously the jury's out, but there are many, many moments where as a parent, I feel like this is a net negative. So how do we design better experiences where technology upholds human needs like togetherness and unity and robust, positive social interactions? I think those are big challenges for us.
For now, I think that's all the time we have. So, Laura, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate all your insights and experience. We've linked her website, as well as many of the products and startups she's worked on, in the episode description for anyone who wants to learn more. Thank you for listening to 30 Years of Big Ideas, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.
HCI Ideas is a podcast celebrating the 30th anniversary of Carnegie Mellon's Human-Computer Interaction Institute. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to follow us and recommend it to your friends. We'd really appreciate it. To learn more about the research done at HCII, our friends have created a website showcasing the papers we talked about today, as well as many more. You can find this at www.hcii30.com. That's 30 with a 30. We just think it's so cool. Thank you for listening to HCI Ideas, and we'll catch you next time.